Welcome to the BOGART Effect, a wealthy wisdom podcast. The following BOGART Effect podcast is intended for general information purposes only. The information discussed is no substitute for personalized investment advice from BOGART or another investment professional. Please see important disclosure information at the end of the presentation. Hey, good morning. Welcome to the BOGART Effect. I've got Geraldo with me, and today's Geraldo's first podcast with the BOGART Effect. Appreciate you joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much, James. Glad to be here, and look forward to talking about required minimum distributions, RMDs.
You stole my thunder, but yeah, required minimum distributions. This is a topic that impacts a lot of our clients because they happen to have retirement accounts. But, to kind of set the stage for today's podcast, I wanted to talk about the three different account types first. I understand it's probably a little bit of a repeat, but it does help the framework. But there are three fundamental types of accounts. There's non-qualified accounts. So this would be brokerage accounts, checking accounts, trust accounts, any type of investment accounts. And with these types of accounts, you pay tax on interest and dividends. You pay tax on capital gains when you sell something at a gain. But there's no age restrictions to them. So you can touch the monies at any point in time. And they're let's just say relatively tax efficient, depending upon the type of investment that you put into those. The second type of accounts are qualified accounts. These are also known as pre-tax accounts. This would be 401ks. This would be 403bs, 457s, would be IRAs, SEP IRAs. And so all of these are tax-deferred assets. And what I mean by that is you put the money in on a tax-favored basis. So for example, if you make $200,000 and you put $20,000 into a 401k, your taxable income actually drops down to 180. So the 200 minus the 20 you put in. So you're only taxed on the 180. These types of accounts grow completely tax-deferred. And then when you pull the money out, which typically is over the age of 59 and a half, you pay ordinary income on those distributions that you're taking out of those accounts. Now, the big benefit is all of the growth is tax deferred. The negative is when you take it out, you have to pay ordinary income. And then the other bigger negative is, actually two negatives, is you're age restricted. So you can't touch these types of accounts until the age of 59 and a half. And then when you reach the magical age of required minimum distributions, you have to start taking out a required amount. And we're going to get into that in today's podcast. So the third types of accounts are called Roth IRAs. Now, Roth IRAs are where you put money in on an after-tax basis. So that whole example of the 200 minus the 20, well, you could still put 20 into a Roth 401k, for example, but you're still taxed at 200, right? So it's going in on an after-tax basis. Then all of the growth, as long as the monies have been in that account for over 5 years and you're over the age of 59 and a half, is completely tax-free. So you can tell that there's a little bit of a math equation that has to be done of, do you want to save into a qualified pre-tax environment, or do you want to save in a Roth type of environment? And that's something here at BOGART Wealth, we're absolutely happy to help you with that math and what that looks like. But the other big part about Roths is that there are no required minimum distributions. So historically speaking, I think it's advantageous for every household to have each of the respective buckets, non-qualified, qualified, and Roth. The Roth money is really the last place that anyone should ever want to touch. And the reason is because you're getting all that tax-free growth and it's tax-free forever. And if you happen to leave any money to your kids, which we're going to talk about inheritance as well, it's also tax-free to them as well. So again, we think it's appropriate to have all three different types of accounts, but it's something to help with the framing of this conversation. So, Geraldo, let's talk about what required minimum distributions really are. And along the way, I'm sure you're going to hear us call them RMDs. It's the same thing, right? We're very guilty yes. in our industry of using acronyms and jargon that can get confusing. But ultimately, let's talk a little bit about what RMDs are.
Yeah. Thanks so much, James. So RMDs, from a big picture perspective, are basically the IRS's price to pay for having those assets grow tax deferred in a non-Roth retirement account. So basically the IRS is saying, look, we're going to give you this advantage. We're going to let these funds grow tax deferred, but we're not going to let you leave it in there for the rest of your lifetimes. At a certain point, at a specific age, they're saying, look, you're going to have to take a specific amount out, and we're going to, tax that as ordinary income tax. And as you mentioned before, all distributions from these tax deferred non-Roth retirement accounts are taxed as ordinary income. And so that goes back into a lot of tax planning. But that's RMDs in a nutshell, and we'll get into the specifics, and we can talk through some examples.
Yeah, and so it's tremendously confusing in terms of the age and timing of these. It's changed so many times over the years. In my career, I've been doing this now for almost 18 years. It was age 70 and a half. Then it got moved to age 72. And then with Secure Act 2.0, it got moved to age 73 or age 75, depended upon what year you were born. So RMDs will start. So for anybody who's born 1959 or before, your RMD age is 73. For anybody born 1960 or later, your RMD age is 75. That can get confusing for some, but it's just know when your birth year is, and that's what determines the math. I would also add the percentage that takes out. That is an IRS mortality table that gets adjusted and modified based upon longevity, but it's a percentage, and every single year you get older and live longer, that percentage gets larger. So for example, it starts at 3.97% at age 73 or age 75 respectively, so call it roughly 4%. If you're fortunate enough to live to 115, the RMD percentage is 52.4%, right? So that percentage gets bigger and bigger and bigger every single year, right? And so what happens here is dependent upon how someone has accumulated their wealth. We talk about those three different buckets, but if they've accumulated a large percentage of their wealth in that qualified pre-tax environment, all of that is going to be subject to these required minimum distributions. And then it really becomes, as Geraldo mentioned, a tax optimization conversation. We firmly believe that every single individual needs to have a financial plan. And when it comes down to it, a financial advisor's job is to help you solve your problems. But it's also to be able to anticipate what your problems are going to be in the future. For a lot of households that have done significant savings in retirement accounts, 401ks, pension lump sum options, et cetera, this can be a very real problem. And what I mean by this is that if you're only withdrawing at a certain percentage of your assets, so let's just, for argument's sake, say it's 3% of what your assets, even if it's 4%, your assets are projected to grow, right? And so what happens is that as your portfolio continues to grow, well, all of a sudden, the assets that are going to be subjected to required minimum distributions gets larger and larger and larger and larger. And so for anyone who's in a situation where they're not proactively thinking about the tax management side of their wealth and how they're accumulating wealth in a tax optimized manner, this is a problem that can ultimately become extremely painful. And the reason is because it's going to force you to pay more in taxes as soon as these required minimum distributions start. And then related to that conversation, it's also going to be one where it's going to impact, for example, your IRMA premiums. It's going to impact inheritance. I mean, there's a whole bunch of cascading implications associated with not proactively thinking about this. And hence why we think it's so important to just do a podcast episode completely dedicated to required minimum distributions. So let's talk about a little bit of the, let's just say, tactical details associated with required minimum distributions. So we mentioned age 73 and age 75, but when do they officially start?
So they officially start, so what the IRS calls the official start of your required minimum distributions, they have the term required beginning date. And again, another industry jargon acronym, RBD. But just think of it as the very first time that you got to take your RMD, it must be taken by April 1st of the year after you reach age 73.
Or 75.
And then, or if you're 75. That's exactly right. Thanks, James. And then after that, after you take that first RMD, RMDs thereafter must be taken by the end of the year, by December 31st, for each year after to satisfy the RMD for that calendar year. One thing to be careful about is if you wait for that very first RMD that you have to take, and you wait until April 1st of the year after you turn age 73 or age 75, you're going to also have to take the RMD for that specific year. So that's something that we help clients plan through to avoid higher taxes that they don't need to pay. We'll help plan that out.
So I want to place an emphasis around what you just said. If
Sure.
you decide to wait until April 1st of the following year, and there are many reasons why we might decide we want to do that. It could be because we're doing other tax management work. It could be because you had a large capital gain. It could be a lot of reasons that were why we do it. But I want to emphasize, if you decide to do that, you're going to have 2 RMDs that first year, because the initial one, we get this option to defer, but every other one has to be done by December 31st. So RMDs are extremely important to track once you hit these ages. Again, a good financial advisor is going to be doing this for you. This is part of a conversation we're integrating into every single discussion we have with our clients that are in these age bands. And by the way, the reason that this is so important is, and I know, Geraldo, you mentioned there's a penalty, but that penalty is 25% of the amount missed is the penalty, plus you have to pay ordinary income. Now, just a little quick caveat, that penalty up until Secure Act 2.0 used to be 50%. It actually, they were kind enough to drop it down from 50% down to 25%. But it's still a heavy penalty because you got to pay the penalty and the tax. So it's costly to miss these things. And we want to make sure that we're appropriately setting up any type of account distribution strategy based upon what the RMDs are going to be. And this is where I want to belabor the point, but I want to emphasize you need to have a financial plan, and you need to have a financial plan that is modeling how these are going to impact you in the future so that we can make decisions today. Like, this is where, when I think about the value that a financial advisor adds for their clients, it really is the integration of financial planning, tax, estate planning, investments, cash flow analysis, asset allocations. All of that needs to be integrated together. It can't just be, I'm doing a plan without looking at everything holistically, or just the investments, et cetera. All right. So when it comes to calculating the amount, I know we mentioned the lifetime table. Anything else you want to add on that one?
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to calculating the actual amount for your RMD, what the IRS does is we have to look at your account balance of, let's say that you have an IRA. We're going to look at the account balance of that IRA account as of December 31st of the preceding year. So we're going to get that exact balance, and then we're going to divide that by what the IRS calls your life expectancy factor. We just look up your age, match that by their factor, and then divide that amount. That comes out to your RMD amount that will need to be paid by December 31st of that particular year.
So I'm going to jump ahead, but I want to use just to you have an example coming up, and I want to make sure we use that. But for example, if someone is in 2025, 75, married filing jointly, if they have $3 million as of December 31st on December 31st of 2024, so we're calculating the RMD for 2025, that individual, because they're 75, the life factor is 24.6%. So we just take the $3 million, divide it by 24.6, and we get the required minimum distribution amount of $121,951. So the federal tax due is projected to be $27,804. And so that's an average tax rate of 22.8% if you're in the 32% bracket, if you have other things going on. Right. So just to quantify this, $3 million account, you're the age 75, it's about $122,000 distribution that's required to come out. And I would add, by the way, if you're 85, that number jumps up to about $180,000. Right. So it gets bigger based upon your age because that life factor is getting bigger and bigger and bigger each year. And one thing I want to note, for most households, this conversation around RMD, this is most of America, right? But this conversation around RMDs is really not a significant one. But for anyone who has accumulated wealth in qualified accounts, this is a very real conversation that needs to be considered and addressed. And sorry I interrupted you, but there was one other thought I had that I wanted to emphasize on how that factor is calculated. But if a husband and wife are more than 10 years apart in age, we actually get to use a different table called the joint annuitant table based upon the age of both spouses, not just the spouse that is of required minimum distribution age. So again, if your spouse is more than 10 years younger than you, we use a different table, not just the one based on your age. That's all.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
A couple other semantics. Let's talk about RMDs on IRAs versus RMDs on 401ks.
Yeah, sure. So great point. So definitely for those folks listening, a very important distinction. So let's say that you have multiple IRA accounts and you're at, for example, you're past age 73, you were born, 1959 or before. You've hit age 73. Now you have RMDs and you have, I'm going to make, for example, 3 IRA accounts. Well, the way to process that to make sure you meet all the requirements for the IRS is you would calculate each RMD for each account separately. So for each IRA, go back to that account balance as of December 31st of the preceding year, divide it by your life expectancy factor. It's going to give you a specific amount. You're going to add those up. The great thing that the IRS allows is flexibility with IRA accounts. You can make the total RMD payment for all 3 accounts from one account or a combination of accounts. You get to choose. One of the major distinctions between IRA accounts and 401k accounts when it comes to RMDs is that for a 401k account, again, you're going to say you have 2 401ks out there. You're going to calculate each of those 401ks separately. But the caveat is for 401ks, you have to withdraw that RMD separately from each 401k account. You can't combine them.
Yep.
And so that's one of the big differences between IRA accounts and 401k accounts for RMDs.
And so for any clients that happen to have highly appreciated company stock in their 401k, and they have decided to defer taking advantage of a strategy, for example, called NUA, Net Unrealized Appreciation. We have other podcasts and webinars on this topic, but for anyone who has decided not to roll their 401k and they happen to have NUA stock in their 401k, the reason that this is so significant is exactly what Geraldo just said. The year of required minimum distribution, you're required to take the distribution from the 401k, which then would theoretically completely disallow this to take advantage of something like NUA if you haven't already done it. So the point here is you need to have an integrated look at this. And coming back to the whole point that I've been belaboring around having a financial plan, we want to make sure that we're looking at all of the pieces to the puzzle to be able to get the desired output and results. One other thing, I love that you mentioned this point as we were prepping. Spouses cannot take on a distribution from their IRA account in lieu of another spouse's IRA account. So, for example, husband and wife, the wife can't do a distribution from her IRA to satisfy the RMD for the husband's account, right? So just important denotion there to be able to make sure that we're emphasizing. One thing I wanted to jump and talk a little bit about qualified charitable distributions, Geraldo.
Sure.
So, we then have a lot of clients who talk to us about how do we manage what these required minimum distributions are going to do to their total financial picture as they're in retirement or nearing retirement, in retirement, or at RMD age. And so one of the things that we talk about for anybody who's charitably or philanthropically inclined is what are called qualified charitable distributions. Why don't you talk a little bit about those for a second?
Yeah, absolutely, James. So qualified charitable distributions, the acronym QCD, what that is, it's a fantastic tool to utilize, again, depending on your overall financial plan and all the moving parts, which we help our clients analyze. But if it makes sense, the requirements are this. If you're 70 and a half, you can use a qualified charitable distribution, which is basically when you have your RMD, let's say that it's, I'm going to make up a number, $150,000 for the current year. You can, and let's say that your cash flow needs are met, you're getting funding from other sources, you don't need to utilize that RMD to meet your living expenses, but you're also charitably inclined, and you have a specific charity that you like to donate to. the IRS allows you to utilize your RMD up to $108,000 for that year to go towards going direct, basically make a distribution directly to the charity from your IRA account. So the charity gets a charitable contribution, which you're doing good, you're helping a cause that you believe in, and you're also with your own financial plan strengthening your plan, because by doing that, it reduces taxable income for you for that year. There's no tax deduction, but it's very, very helpful because it reduces your overall taxable income instead of counting towards and being taxed at your ordinary income tax rate. So it's a pretty powerful tool.
Fantastic. One of the things I wanted to emphasize that could be very confusing is you mentioned the age of 70 and a half. So here's where tax law hasn't necessarily all been updated simultaneously and kind of the hodgepodge of things. But the age 70 and a half comes back to what RMD age historically was, right? I mentioned early on in the podcast that RMDs used to start at the age of 70 and a half. So there's actually potentially an opportunity here for anybody who's philanthropically inclined. Once they attain the age of 70 and a half, they can actually start doing these qualified charitable distributions. Now, no, they don't have an obligation to pull off of the RMDs, or excuse me, they don't have an obligation to pull off the IRAs because of RMDs yet, because they haven't reached the age of 73 or 75. However, being able to do a distribution of $108,000 could reduce the balance of the account. So all of the continued future tax-free growth could happen, again, not in the account, and the charity gets to benefit from it. So to emphasize this point, this is a $108,000 distribution. To make this work, it has to go directly to the charity from your IRA account. So your advisor should process this for you. But again, it's either reducing the account balance, and if you're over the age of an RMD age 73 or 75, it's reducing the balance of the RMD. One other thing I wanted to add was you're actually able to do this for husband and wife. So you can do, again, we'll find creative ways of giving away money, but you can do a $216,000 distribution from an IRA account, and it's completely tax-free as long as it goes directly to a charity, right? So this is something from an advanced planning perspective. We've had clients, for example, who are very philanthropically inclined. Most of the wealth has been accumulated in the IRA accounts. And so we've deferred some of the giving that they're doing simply because we wanted to attain the age of 70 and a half to be able to do some of the larger and more substantive gifts that they wanted to do. Right. So again, it's a planning strategy to do. I want to emphasize the point that you made earlier, though. This is not a tax deduction. Right. It is a distribution from an IRA that goes directly to a charity that does not get taxed. Right. So that's the big point here is as long as and to make it work, it has to go directly to charity. Yes. Another little sidebar, they cannot go to donor advised funds. They have to go directly to a 501c3. So yes, again, appropriate planning is required here.
That's right. Yeah. So if you do have a donor advised fund and you do want to make the qualified tradable distribution, as you mentioned, James, and that's an excellent point. The donor advised fund is separate. You can't touch it for that purpose. The qualified tradable distribution has to come from the IRA. So literally the custodian that holds the IRA account will be cutting a check from your account and sending it to the charity.
Bingo.
You actually don't need funds to cut the check.
So I want to talk in the last little section of the podcast around inheriting these types of accounts, because I know there's a lot of confusion around what inherited required minimum distributions look like. So why don't you talk a little bit about spouses first, and then let's talk about non-spouses.
Yeah, absolutely, James. So the IRS has definitely made the rules confusing. So we're here to shed a little bit of light and some color and try to simplify this for folks to understand. So when it comes down for spouses, so when you inherit an IRA from a spouse is what's considered an eligible designated beneficiary. That's a term from the IRS. All that means is that the spouse gets more favorable status and they can take that RMD over their lifetimes if they choose. Can
we pull on that real quick? Because I know I mentioned let's talk about spouses, but there are more than just spouses that fall into that eligible designated beneficiary status. Who else qualifies there?
Yeah, thank you so much, James. That's exactly right. So the other individuals that qualify for that status, so you can also have a minor child that's under 21 years of age, a minor child of the IRA owner that's under 21, someone who's chronically ill or disabled, or someone not more than 10 years younger than the IRA owner. Those are all considered eligible designated beneficiaries, which get that favorable treatment, which they can choose to take those distributions over their lifetime versus a non-eligible designated beneficiary, which is pretty much any individual who's not in one of those categories. They have to follow what's called the 10-year rule and take those distributions out within 10 years. There's some caveats to that I could go over in a bit, but those categories, especially a surviving spouse, a minor child, they get that favorable treatment.
Yeah, I mean, kind of mentally, I just bucket it into two. It's either spouses or everybody else, right? Like, I know there's semantics on the eligible designated beneficiary, but the thing with spouses is, for all intents and purposes, the spouses have flexibility just like the IRA owner does. So they can either roll it to their own IRA and use their age. They can keep it in their deceased spouse's IRA, take it based upon the deceased spouse's age, or they could distribute it over a 5 or 10 year period, whatever it is that they wanted. They can just live off of the money. But the spousal beneficiary designations have a tremendously larger amount of flexibility than non-spousal beneficiaries.
That's exactly right. They have a very large flexibility on the options they can choose from. And again, it just comes back to what makes sense for the overall financial plan. And for us, really knowing in depth our client situation and walking them through that to help them make a choice that optimizes their overall plan for them.
So let's talk about RMDs or inherited IRA accounts for non-spouses. You mentioned the 10-year rule. Let's dive into that one a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. So for basically everyone else outside of a spouse, the non-eligible designated beneficiaries, the 10-year rule applies. So what that means, when the original owner of the IRA passes before their required minimum distribution date. So you have the original owner of the IRA, they've passed away before they hit that specific age where they have to start taking RMDs. If that happens and you're that beneficiary, what the IRS states is you must withdraw all funds within 10 years. You could do all that in year 10, for example. That beneficiary does not have to take the annual RMD, but they do have to withdraw all of those funds from the IRA within 10 years. They can wait until year 10 if they wanted to, or they can do it in the combination of years. But again, every time they take that distribution, whether they wait or not, it's going to be taxed as ordinary income to that beneficiary. So there's tax planning and tax optimization that involved with that as well, discussions. Now, so one thing to keep in mind, there's really two separate categories. One, what we just talked about, if the owner of the IRA dies before the required minimum distribution date. But what happens if the other scenario, if the original owner of the IRA account dies on or after their RMD date? Well, this rule kicks in, which is the RMDs they must be taken annually over those 10 years, starting the year after the account owner dies.
Yeah, but it's the RMD, it's the RMD equivalent of what the deceased owner had to take out, right? So it's not a 10th.
That's right.
So right. Let's just, and I'm going to make up the numbers. Let's say that someone inherits a $2 million IRA account. Well, we obviously know 10 years, if you just divided it by 10, that's $200,000 a year, right? Make that math simple. But to your point, if mom or dad were not taking RMDs, we don't have to do the 200. We could wait all the way until year 10, take the $2 million out. You're going to pay huge tax because that's a $2 million taxable event, or you could choose to incrementally spread it out over a couple years or 10 years example. But if mom or dad was over the age of 73 or 75, and they were taking an RMD, I'll just say that the RMD, for simple purposes was $20,000. You know, that's 10%. It's a little high, but let's just say it's $20,000 based upon mom and dad's age. Well, that means that the person who inherits it has to take out at least that 20, and that percentage is growing each year based upon mom and dad's life factor, right? But let's just say they have to take at least the 20 each year, and they might choose to take more simply because they don't want to have the bigger tax bill later on, right? But they have to do at least that required amount each year if mom or dad passed away over their RMD age. This is something that has been so confusing because the IRS only gave us clarity on this last year. And these rules changed back in 2019. So it has been very ambiguous, but they have been explicitly clear now that if mom or dad was RMD age, you absolutely need to be doing this. So, you know, what I like to emphasize with this conversation is RMD planning really is a family conversation. It's not just the owner of the IRA account, because if you're in the very beautiful and fortunate position that you're going to leave legacy to your children, clearly, this is something that's going to also have an impact on them as well. And in most instances, your children, when they inherit these things, are going to be adults. They're going to be, again, probably working, and they're probably going to be in the higher earning years of their careers when they inherit these things. So the probability of the distributions that are coming out based on your IRA accounts is pretty high that it's going to be relatively expensive. And you know, that's one thing that I just want to be very cognizant of. We talk about planning and having a plan, but if there's a legacy component, which a lot of households have, we need to be interfacing the conversation around how are we transferring wealth to the next generation. And I'll admit, we have clients that say, I don't care, right? They're getting money, they pay a tax bill, right? But we also have a large segment of our client base that is very cognizant of, I want as much as possible to go to my next generation and heirs. And this is something where we need to be interfacing on the implications of required minimum distributions and what that does. So that leads to the probably epicenter of what can you be doing to manage and mitigate RMDs. Well, that's where we talk about Roth conversions. And this is where the interface of tax planning with financial planning is so important. Now, we have entire podcasts on Roth conversions, so I'm not going to dedicate this one to that. But what a Roth conversion is where we make a decision to take an amount from an IRA, and we usually will do this in a year where we're in a very low tax environment or relatively low tax environment to where we project you to be. We then make the decision to convert an amount from an IRA over to a Roth account. We then move those funds from the IRA into the Roth. That then starts a new 5-year clock. But those monies are now growing tax-free forever. Now, inherited Roth IRAs still have the same 10-year rule that Geraldo was mentioning, but they can grow once they're inherited for another 10 years completely tax-free. So again, it comes back to the interfamily conversation that we need to be having, because if you're going to be leaving wealth to the kids, the best place you can leave them wealth is the Roth, because it's going to grow for another 10 years after your passing, completely tax-free, and there's no required minimum distributions on an annualized basis from those accounts. So it's a win-win for a household. One thing I also want to emphasize related to RMDs is most modeling is assuming that both husband and wife live till, in our case, we use age 90 for a lot of them, right? But that's not always reality, unfortunately, right? And so when we're modeling this, it's important to talk about the ages of both of you and how long both of you are going to live. However, if one of you predeceases the other, as we've talked about with these spousal inherited IRAs, that RMD amount is not going to change, right? So if you are, I'll make up the numbers, but if your annual RMD is $200,000, well, while you're married, you're in the 22% tax bracket, right? It's pretty clean. But when you are now a widow or widower, you're using single tax rates. So now all of a sudden you're getting pushed into potentially the 32% tax bracket just because your spouse passed away. So this integration and tax management work is imperative. Yes, it's important to model it based upon what your expectations for longevity are, but let's also be cognizant of the fact that if there's anything that's going to cause one of the two of you to potentially predecease the other, that can also have a material implication on this long-term planning work we've done. We had a client who both of them worked at their employer. Both of them had accumulated pretty nice size qualified accounts. And we started doing this tax interface work. They retired. We were able to use non-qualified money to bring their taxable income very, very low. That gave us the latitude to have this conversation around Roth conversions. And to put some numbers to this, this couple was projected to be in the 35% bracket once their required minimum distributions were kicking in. For them, it was age 73, but that was a 28% effective tax rate, right? So their marginal bracket was 35, but their effective rate, the rate that they're actually paying, was 28. Well, when they retired, we were able to use savings and non-qualified money, and their effective tax rate dropped below 10%. Well, this to me is like the aha light bulb moment. Like, there's no reason why I should stay in the 10% bracket if in the matter of 10 or 15 years, I'm going to be in the 28, right? So this is where that Roth conversion conversation becomes so important. So we're making a cognizant decision to pull money out of an IRA account, pay ordinary income now. So yes, it's an expense on the tax side early on, but we're moving it over into a Roth. So it's now growing tax-free forever. Now, I'm going to come back to this conversation of this couple because unfortunately the husband passed away at the age of 68. And now you're talking about very large IRA accounts because the spouse was able to blend them in, right, and merge it together. But now you're talking about very large IRA accounts, and the RMDs are going to be based solely off of single tax rates. And so immediately, where we were talking about 35 and a 28% effective tax rate, now we're in the 37, and that effective tax rate is moving up even faster. So fortunately, we had done significant Roth conversions prior to the passing of the husband, right? But this is an example where there's an organic and dynamic element that goes into financial planning, and it has to be reviewed on a consistent basis, at least annually, to talk about how these strategies are interfacing with each other. So I know we went into some weeds a little bit here, but I think the key takeaway is you need to have a financial plan. You need to be managing and looking at what the implications are of required minimum distributions, especially if you've accumulated wealth in retirement accounts. Geraldo, thank you for your time today. This was a great and productive conversation. And if you have any questions, please interact with us. We've got a whole team of financial advisors, and we're delighted to be a resource for you. But thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, James.
The previous presentation by Bogart Wealth was intended for general information purposes only. No portion of the presentation serves as the receipt of or as a substitute for personalized investment advice from Bogart Wealth or any other investment professional of your choosing. Different types of investments involve varying degrees of risk, and it should not be assumed that future performance of any specific investment or investment strategy or any other non-investment related or planning services, discussion, or content will be profitable, be suitable for your portfolio or individual situation, or prove successful. Neither Bogart Wealth's investment advisor registration status nor any amount of prior experience or success should be construed that a certain level of results or satisfaction will be achieved if Bogart Wealth is engaged or continues to be engaged to provide investment advisory services. Bogart Wealth is neither a law firm nor accounting firm, and no portion of its services shall be construed as legal or accounting advice. No portion of the podcast content should be construed by a client or prospective client as a guarantee that he or she will experience a certain level of results if Bogart Wealth is engaged or continues to be engaged to provide investment advisory services. Copies of Bogart Wealth's current written disclosure brochure and Form CRS discussing our advisory services and fees are available upon request or at www.bogartwealth.com.